So we knew pretty early on in the project that the game would be set in New York City's rainy autumn season. We also knew that our weather system would have to support varying levels of intensity, from residual puddles kind of left after a rain in the open world, and to heavy storms that would intensify key dramatic moments in our story missions, like the one that you just saw. I'm going to cover the three elements of our weather system that help define the look of rain in Spider-Man. So we'll be looking at wet surfaces, dynamic splashing, and the character rain composite shader. So first, let's talk about our approach to wet surfaces. At Insomniac, we have a proprietary engine with a node-based material graph editor. Using that tool, our environment artists first prototyped the look of wet surfaces on one of our global environment shaders. And here's a video of that test. The artist used a mask UV'd in world space to define the puddle areas. And then to achieve the wet look, they increased the gloss and specular of the material in those areas. Finally, they scrolled two normal maps across the surface of the puddle to achieve some sort of turbulence in the water to make it look like it was moving. This prototype provided our tech art and core rendering teams, kind of the programming teams, a solid idea of where we wanted to take the look of the weather system. So we began to scope out the feature by setting some goals for ourselves. We wanted the feature to be efficient, so to run quickly, procedural. As currently implemented with this example, we would have to duplicate all the node logic to our over like 50 material graphs used in the open world, and every time we made a change, we would have to update all 50 of those. We wanted it to be iterative. We had a super fast approaching deadline. It's game development, so you know. We also wanted it to be physically based. The example that the environment artists put together wasn't really physically based, so we wanted to double down on that. And we also wanted to provide a range of parameterized storm intensities. The same system would have to work for our rain time of day as well as sequences like the rooftop cinematic by just increasing a few scalars, numbers, intensity, things like that. So using a 2012 blog post by Sebastian Lagarde for reference, it doesn't rain in LA, so we had to find reference elsewhere where it does rain. We observed that as surfaces become wet, their diffuse becomes darker, so their color gets darker, it becomes glossier, and it appears more reflective. So as water begins to cool, the surface normal of the material becomes flatter, so you lose some of that normal map detail. We also observed that the strength of these effects depends on the porosity of the material. It's basically how much a material can absorb water. So for example, dirt, which is very porous, tends to absorb quite a lot of water. It becomes very dark and shiny. On the other hand, surfaces like marble with a smoother appearance tend to not absorb as much water at all, and their surface properties tend to remain fairly unmodified. So in order to achieve the look, we had to make similar adjustments to each of the materials in the world. The Insomniac engine uses deferred rendering. If you're unfamiliar with what that is, a simple explanation might be that the scene ultimately gets represented as a set of screen space textures called G-buffers, so it's just essentially a bunch of textures. There are textures for diffuse, gloss, normal, and many other surface properties that would be found on a standard material that you might be used to. It just happens in screen space, so it's kind of just a single texture at the end. Those textures are lit with a shader that contains your lighting model. So we decided to do most of the heavy lifting for surface wetness in a screen space shader that modifies those G-buffers before the lighting is applied. That was a quick and efficient way to apply the observations that we made in the presentation to the entire scene in one go. So, as I mentioned before, the strength of this effect is based on the material's porosity. So to derive the porosity, so to calculate the porosity for each of our materials in the engine, we took the roughness of our materials and multiplied it by itself, and the result of that porosity pass kind of looked like this. So you can see the shiny elements in the scene are darker in color in our porosity kind of texture. It's also, and the rougher materials are white. It's worth noting that this test map isn't exactly PBR, so there are some elements that may appear more porous than they really should be, or vice versa. Once we were comfortable with how we were deriving that porosity, we baked that to a texture so that we could hand tweak the value ranges that seemed too porous. So that's a representation. Essentially, it is a texture, so you can go in and kind of modify specific parts to make specific materials more wet or less wet. To achieve our wet look in the engine, we darkened the material's diffuse, the color, by squaring it and then interpolating its gloss, so increasing its gloss towards 1.0. We also flattened the texture-based normal mapping. So it looked like that. So go back and forth. I should mention that we customized the influence of wet surfaces based on their lighting models. So for skin, hair, cloth, and dual anisotropic lighting models, these are kind of our special ones outside the standard stuff. It doesn't read really well. So for example, on the cloth, we had to come up with a custom solution for that. It was basically kind of tweaking the diffuse change and the gloss change. Here are some shots of wet surfaces in the game. This is with wet surfaces off. There are puddles in there, which is a separate thing we'll get to in a second. But and then that's with wet surfaces on. So off and on, off, on. Here's another shot. This is with wet surfaces off and on. Off, on, and here's another one, off, and on, and another shot. Sorry, I just have to catch up. So this is a look of the diffuse buffer. So this is essentially all of the materials diffuse the color, and before wetness is applied, and then after wetness is applied. So you can see everything's kind of getting a little bit darker. And then for gloss, we increase the gloss. So as surfaces become wet, they become shinier. So next, we wanted surfaces that were horizontal to receive a ripple animation, like the ground and rooftops, for example. So using the world space normal, we isolated a section of the surfaces facing upwards. The world space normal is essentially like the direction of each of the materials on the each of the surfaces on the screen. In this image, the areas in white will receive the rippling texture. So these are all the surfaces that are facing upwards. Our ripples are generated virtually in off-screen render texture. Essentially just a texture that you can't see in the game, but it's rendered kind of in the background. And then using a special shader, we render an animated height map. And then we turn that into a tangent space normal map. And the strength of the normal kind of perturbation, the ripples, is based on the porosity as well. So the rough materials don't receive any rippling, where the glossy surfaces kind of receive the full effect. So you can imagine like water on marble, for example, would get a ripple, but then water on dirt, for example, would have a significantly less pronounced ripple animation. So we packed an additional channel into that 1D texture before that I talked about the porosity texture, and we allow that kind of allowed us to manipulate the strength of the normal map per material. So we come up with kind of a generic solution, and then as needed, we would go through and kind of change the different sections of materials to manipulate that strength of the normal flattening. And then here is a look at that off-screen render texture. So you can see the tangent space normal map for the ripples being generated. And then this is what it looks like in-game on a material. We fade out and stop generating the ripples after about 1/16 of the depth buffer. This is specifically for performance reasons. We can't generate ripples for the entire scene. So for kind of a short distance, you will get those ripples, and you can't really see it because we fade it off in the distance, so it tend to work pretty well. For vertical surfaces, we do the same G-buffer modifications, so we do the same darkening, increasing the gloss, things like that. But on high gloss surfaces, anything above about 65% glossy, things like glass, for example, we render a 512 by 512 droplet texture that's also UV'd in world space. So it's kind of UV'ing in world space, essentially like a cube. The droplet texture is a single channel texture that we authored in Substance Designer, and using it, we bias the existing surface normal. So in the white areas of the texture, we shift the normal upwards to seek the hotspots in the environment's reflection cube map. Generally speaking, our cube maps tended to be darker below the horizon, and kind of brighter at the top of the horizon. That's why we kind of changed the surface normal to face upwards. And it gave us some nice glints of bright spots on the surface, like the windows. And I think you can see that up in the corner right there. And essentially what that means is like, if your wall is kind of horizontal, vertical, like this, we trick the shader into thinking that it's faced like this, so you get the light from above. Does that make sense? Okay. For those surfaces, we also eliminate droplets in the textures. We use a cheap Berlin noise shader, which is generated at one time. We don't use a texture for that. It's just in the shader. And it kind of pans across the surface. A clamp is applied to the Berlin noise, so that some of the brighter raindrops in the texture remain persistent. And it kind of gives it this illusion of droplets running down the glass, and they kind of appear and disappear. There are some that remain as well. For rough surfaces, like bricks, for example, we don't do any additional things to the standard G-buffer modifications. We did play with using kind of a streak map that would look like kind of rain falling down the side of the building. Different kinds of animation methods, but they ended up being barely noticeable. So to save some performance, we just kind of eliminated that feature. It is something that we plan to look at in the future, though. This is kind of a close-up of the glossy surfaces with the droplets. Hopefully you can see that. So once we had finalized the look, we moved on to parameterization, which essentially takes some of the values in the shader and exposes them to the artist so that they can modify them. And we had to support a range of signal intensities from essentially light rain to excessive downpour. So we made two 0 to 1 parameters, wetness and density. These are both set in our atmosphere configs. We have different atmosphere configuration files for different times of day. And they're both static values, so you set it and that's what you get for the entire duration of that time of day. But they could have been animated, we just never did it. That said, when we generate a wind gust, we have a system that generates wind. We slightly increase the density for the duration of that gust, so you'll get a wind gust and it looks like there's more rain droplets. And we also push the ripples in the direction of that wind. Wetness is used to represent the amount of accumulated water, and it controls the amount of G-buffer modification, so the intensity of that rain modification, the screen space stuff. And it also controls the strength of the ripple normal. So here's a video of that on the left. And I'm just decreasing the wetness value there. So density is intended to simulate the intensity of the storm. The parameter controls the number of ripples that are spawned and the maximum size that the ripples grow to, as well as their lifetime. So how big they get and then how long they're there for. Density also controls the number of splash particles that we generate, which I'll talk about in a few. Here's the video of that, the density being set. And if you look closely, it might be a little bit hard to see. There's wind gusts that are generated, and you can see the ripples kind of move in a specific direction. So we were pretty happy with that. We thought it gave the artist and the lighting artist enough control over how intense they wanted their storm. We also supported a secondary pipeline for artist-placed puddles. There was a similar modification made to the materials diffuse, gloss, and normal. This was done on the material graph, so this was done on the node logic for each of those materials. The effect is persistent regardless of the time of day. So, for example, if it's sunny, you still get those kind of puddles in the open world. And the artist can enable puddles on the material and then choose the source for the puddle location. They can paint vertex color. And we also used a 3D noise texture as a mask. This was a noise texture that was kind of scaled across the entire world. It was a randomized placement, but it was super easy to enable, and you got a bunch of puddles really fast. The fall-off ratio takes into, so how the puddle kind of sits in the material, takes into account the material's height map, such that the puddles appear to sit within the underlying surface details, so you would get kind of more puddles in the cracks of the material. We also take that ratio and soften it slightly and apply kind of a subtler effect as the puddle gets thinner on the material. And it gives it kind of a feathered edge look. It looks pretty nice instead of being that hard kind of edge at the end of a puddle. We added this feature to the rooftop and ground material graphs, and we procedurally generated vertex color for the roads and sidewalks in Houdini. It just took way too long for an artist to go in and paint all of those, so we used Houdini and just kind of randomly applied the vertex color to those. We did the same thing for vertex blending for different materials, different asphalt textures, things like that. Rooftops tended to use the 3D noise thing, where you didn't have to make any type of vertex color adjustments. You just turned it on and you would get puddles. So this is what that looks like in engine. The artist here is just painting puddles. This is obviously a test bed. So next, I want to talk about dynamic splashing, which is a feature we created for the rain impacts. Originally in the E3 demo, the vertical raindrops, the kind of falling raindrops, were lit per pixel, and it was costing us about 2 milliseconds to render them, which is a lot. Both art direction and render were pretty dissatisfied with the number of raindrops that we could generate. We just wanted more to kind of sell the turbulent weather conditions, and increasing the number obviously kind of killed our performance. So we switched them to per vertex lighting, and it allowed us to double or triple the number of drops that were being drawn. Unfortunately, this exposed another problem. It was pouring with rain, but we only had a few impacts of the rain on the scene geometry. And I mean, like the things that kind of splash, right? As the raindrop hits the object, it kind of makes a particle effect. So we had tens of thousands of raindrops of rain, vertical rain particles now, but only a handful of the splashes when the rain hits a physical object. It was pretty difficult to see, and visually it just wasn't working. The original implementation used breakcasts on the CPU to find a collision mesh and then spawn the visual effects when it detected a hit. It was very costly for the original rain implementation. So we decided to take another look at that system, and we wanted to create a CPU-friendly solution. So we decided to move forward with a new GPU particle type for the engine. We did not use GPU particles before, so this was kind of an interesting exploration that we were doing. And it took about 3 days for one of our principal engineers at Dual to get it up and running. And this was the first image that he sent me, which we were pretty, I know it's low resolution, but we were super pleased with this. When he first sent me the email and I saw this, I was out on vacation, and it like blew my mind. I was super happy. I think you can see the splashes on the rooftop of the car. And then I've got another close-up of that. That looks like raindrops, right? And then here's another close-up. You can see them kind of on the ground, like right here. All those white dots are the raindrops. And then here's another shot. And if you look carefully, you can see that the splashes aren't being drawn underneath the overhang of the HVAC system here. So they're kind of like in this area, there are no raindrops being spawned, impacts being spawned there. So let's talk about implementation. So when we render the view, we have a 3D camera frustum that extends from the near clip to about 6,000 meters. We obviously can't cover the entire view with the GPU splashes, so we clamp the frustum to about 16 meters, which is that section there. And then we construct a world-aligned volume for the programmers in the room. This is an axis-aligned bounding box around that specific area. We then create a shadow casting light that's invisible to the player, and the light kind of sits on the top of that volume. No lighting information is calculated for that particular light. We're simply using it to generate an orthogonal 16-bit shadow map around the player. As the player moves around the world, that shadow map follows. And then this is a look at what it looks like. So MJ standing in Central Park here, and then the shadow map that's being generated for that character is on the right. So we force everything to render through that, all deferred, forward, and blended materials. That means glass gets rendered through this, leaves, everything like that. They all get rendered into that shadow map. And what we're recording here is actually the distance from the top of the volume to the bottom to its nearest kind of hit, right? And then the shadow map is generated for that view there. So after we render that shadow map, we voxelize the volume by splitting it into 1x1 tiles in XZ. If you've played Minecraft, it's kind of a similar concept. And for each cell, we allocate two 16 by 16 render targets. These are just essentially textures that are rendered off screen. This allows us to have 256 splashes per square meter. So a pixel is a splash. I'm going to call these slots for reference in the future. The first render target is a 32-bit single channel texture. It contains the current and maximum lifetime of the splash in each one of those slots. Every frame, we update this render target, decrementing its current lifetime, and once it reaches the end of its lifetime, that slot becomes available again to generate a new splash. The second render target is used to store the spawn position of that splash. So when a vertical raindrop is generated, the GPU splashing system knows its world position and then goes to check the closest cell to see which slots are available. If we have a slot open, we store its XZ position as an offset from the voxelized cell's world position. Essentially means that we get a more granular location. And then we store that world position into the second render target. We then use the shadow map we generated with the shaft light, and we treat that as sort of a depth buffer, so a texture that indicates depth. And then we derive the Y position of the impact. Our engine is Y up, so Y is the position of that impact facing upwards. So with those three things, we now have an XYZ position to spawn a particle. The geometry that we spawn for the particle can either be a simple camera-facing plot or a Y-axis aligned billboard, depending on the surface slope. So here's a look at a textureless prototype. This was kind of the first implementation. You'll notice with the shadow map, things are getting kind of cold. Spider-Man's gonna land underneath a tree here, and you'll see that the tree underneath the tree is not getting any impact particles. We also supported adding volumes. So he's standing right now. The reason that area isn't getting raindrops right there is because there's a volume that kind of blocks those raindrops. So we can choose specific areas that we don't want raindrops to spawn if for some reason that's what the artist wanted. For the material, we use a 4-frame flipbook packed into a 256 by 64 RGBA texture. We split the impact material into 2 classifications, horizontal and slope surfaces. For horizontal surfaces, we randomly choose a flipbook from the red, green, and blue channels. They're represented here. The top 3 that are indicated as horizontal surfaces we pack into those red, green, and blue channels. Then we classify any angle over 15 degrees to be a sloped surface, and then spawn the flipbook in the alpha channel, which stores kind of an omnidirectional splash. Unlike the horizontal impacts, these are randomly rotated around camera Z. You can see it doesn't kind of have like that bottom edge that the other flipbooks have. The horizontal splash textures, the top 3 there, were created in Maya. We just used a Bifrost simulation. I think what I did was I just dropped a sphere into a volume, like a box, and measured out a few frames of that simulation. And then the slope surface flipbook was just hand authored in Photoshop. The material is lit per vertex with no specular response. The particles are so small that They didn't require any spec, which makes them super fast to light. And then we simply alpha blend them with the scene, similar to a standard particle that you would have in Unreal or Unity. So the final topic I'd like to discuss is going to be the raindrop shader effect that one of our other technical artists, Jay Twasan, added to our characters during cinematics. So in this shot, streaks can be seen running down Otto's face, and the droplets on his shoulders are catching a nice specular highlight from the cinematic lighting. This is the effect that we're talking about. And here is a different sequence that we added them to Miles' jacket during gameplay. You can see the speck hits on his shoulder and back. We kind of did this as needed when there was like a close-up or something really specific that the art director wanted you to be able to see the raindrops on those characters. And we added that to each of the material graphs. Each of the materials has like a kind of a sub-graph. It was like a section of logic that we could just kind of duplicate and put into any graph that we wanted. We used it in some other areas as well, on props, where we felt that it was needed because there was a close-up or something like that. Generally speaking, the procedural effects that happen to the entire world worked really well, but in some cases we really wanted that kind of extra look. So this is the node graph, and we can break down that section. For the droplet effect, we used the standard model's UVs and applied this texture at a high tiling rate. In the green channel, we store a set of droplets with a feathered edge. The feathered edge is going to be what allows the droplet to expand as we apply some value clamping in the shader over its lifetime. The blue channel is our time offset. This allows each droplet to have its own initial lifetime, and it's also used to make the droplets dry up over time. Sorry. So next I want to look at the timer section of the graph. Just that section. We're using a timer node with a variable speed. That's an ever-increasing value that takes in the engine. Unreal Unity have a similar node in their material graph editors. The timer is added to our offset texture, the offset channel in the raindrop texture. This is going to increase the value of our textures as the engine ticks, so every frame. If we think about that texture as numbers, where black is 0 and white is 1, over time, the areas that are 0 black on the texture will incrementally become 1 white. And then we take the fractional part of that. The function only returns the decimal point of its input. That means that once a value hits 1.0, it goes all the way back to black or 0. So that's what it looks like. Then we add it back to the gradient channel and use the for function. That function returns the largest integer of its input. So as soon as a pixel that's not black appears on the texture, it snaps to white. And this makes the droplets appear to grow over time. Finally, in this setup, we multiply the inverse of the time section of our graph, giving our droplets kind of varying opacity as they grow, and they slowly disappear over their lifetime. Yes, there you go. We use this mask to darken the diffuse, increase the gloss, and bias the normal. Sounds like our wet surfaces shader. It's essentially the same thing. We also apply similar masks so that they only appear on the horizontal surfaces facing upwards. You wouldn't want to droplet kind of, on the body of the character. So next, let's take a look at the node graph for the streaks that we apply to the vertical portions of the character. Which is there. This section is a basic setup for UV tiling and rotation. We support rotating UVs in cinematic in case the character gets flipped upside down, which happens more often than you might think. We need the droplets to travel in the same direction in world space, always down. You wouldn't want a droplet kind of traveling upwards. That would look weird. These UVs are plugged into our wiggle texture. We use this texture to jitter the U position of our UVs back and forth as we scroll it downwards. It might be difficult to see, but you can see that you should be able to see that the green parts of our texture coordinates are bleeding kind of into the yellow. This section I just showed in the video on the last slide, but notice that there's a bunch of scaling that we're doing in the wiggle texture to get some pleasing results before we plug that back into the UV translate node. If we were to leave it as is, you would get wiggles that go completely across the texture. And then this is our main channel texture that contains our rain streak. In the first two channels, we're storing a normal map to give the rain streak some dimensionality. And in the blue channel, it contains a mask with some gradation. Let me go back. From the tail to the head of the droplet. The gradation allows the raindrop to kind of disappear over time. Notice how straight the droplets look here. That's where the wiggle mask texture comes in. And we wiggle our UVs so that the texture kind of moves back and forth, and this is what we get. So it's the normal on the left, and then the mask on the right. We use the mask to influence diffuse and gloss like we had before, and then apply the animated normal on the left as a detailed normal to the mesh's original texture map. So here it is in action on auto. So that kind of wraps it up for the three sections. We covered the wetness effect, the dynamic splashing, and now the character rain. And I do want to finish by replaying the first video that I showed so that you can kind of see the stuff that we talked about in context.
How do you like my new suit? Yash, where'd you get it? It's an exclusive. In fact, we don't have to do this at all if you don't want to.
We definitely want to.
Each of you has a job to do. Your debts will be repaid when we're done. Go!
So, there you go. Some special thanks for our engineering team and our art team, and obviously we are hiring, so if this stuff interests you, you should apply. I do have a few minutes for questions if anyone has them. So.
Why you use like the shadow?
So for the rain droplets, where like you have that area where you have like some black and white, we have some droplets here and here we don't have any, right? You said use like the lights.
Yep.
Why you did that with lighting and not with like standard ray casting?
It was way faster to do it with lighting.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
I thought it would be.
No, it was like it was. So we also turned the key the directional light, so there's no sun in rain time of day. So what we saved was using it's essentially the same kind of shadow map that we use for the sun for this. So the time that we saved by turning off the sunlight, we could use by generating that shadow map, and it was faster than doing it with raycast.
Just another thing, how high was like the light? Because like if I was on a, let's say on a stadium and like there's a surface that's very very high, like up from me, and I'm standing down here, how the system knows like?
It goes up 60 meters, and anything above that just doesn't register.
Okay, so that's why some of the places the artists have to place some stuff there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, nice, thank you.
Yep.
Hi there, thanks for the talk, firstly, and I was wondering, we see all those exclusive games like with high fidelity graphics and awesome visuals. What are the perks, like the good aspects of working on a single console or a single platform to release a game in that aspect, like technically and visually?
It's kind of a tough question. There are specific parts of the different consoles that we can kind of tap into. So PlayStation has its advantages and Xbox has its advantages. I don't really know them offhand, but it certainly allows us to kind of focus on one platform. So we can find bugs and things like that and iterate on a single platform without having to take into account kind of stuff that you might find on Xbox, for example. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's a good answer. It's easier to do it for one platform than it is for multiple platforms. Because of bugs.
Anyone?
Sorry. Thanks for the talk. About the ripples, when it is on an edge, how its behavior? It will bend?
We fade them at like 15 degrees. So you just don't ever see it because it never, it's always cut before you would get to that edge. But yes, if we didn't do that, you'd get it it would go over the edge and it gets stretched, and it looks terrible. Did you have another question?
Hi there. How long time did you spend to do this weather system?
It's probably about a month. Yeah. It was like an engineer, myself, another technical artist, and there was also some sound stuff that I didn't talk about. The sound system integrates completely with the parameters that I talked about before, so sound increases its intensity with the weather as well. It was probably about a month while we were doing other things.
Overall, just the screen space, how much milliseconds did it take to render everything?
Super fast. I don't know what it is offhand, but it was unnoticeable. It was incredibly fast, yeah.
And just another question that I didn't understand properly is the porosity map that you said.
Yeah.
You make it per object, or it's based on the
It's in screen
exclusion?
space. It's not actually a texture. It's just done in the shader, and it's totally in screen space. We just take the roughness G buffer and multiply it by itself, and that's how you get it.
Yeah. And the particle effects, how much milliseconds did it take to render? You know?
To do the I won't be able to give you an I don't know, but I could find out though. So if you want to follow up with me after, I can get you the actual answer. It's been so long since I've had it, so
One more question.
Hi, I have seen that you guys used Houdini to do some stuff on the game, but I would like to know what was it used, because it has to do with procedural stuff.
Yeah, so I didn't do a lot of work on the Houdini side, but essentially our buildings are like blocked out with, we call them polylines. So in our editor, you can draw a curve, and then that curve, we can export that curve to Houdini, and Houdini will look at like a building set. So we have a bunch of modular pieces for all of our buildings, and Houdini will fill in that information. So we'll build the building for you, and then the artist goes in and customizes each of those buildings. There's some other stuff that we do, like our traffic systems are all done in Houdini. Some prop placement, gameplay tagging, all this stuff. There's a good talk that someone did at GDC about how we, Dave Santiago, about how we used Houdini. There's a really good talk if that interests you. You should check it out. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Por favor, aplausos para